Chapter 6, Section 3. The War Widens. Why it matters. Many early battles of the American Revolution were fought in the Northeast, but the struggle for independence was waged on many fronts and affected Americans in all parts of the country. Section Focus Question. How did the effects of the war widen? African Americans in the war. African Americans fought on both sides of the American Revolution. For them, the war meant both danger and opportunity. Free and slave. From the beginning, free African Americans took part in the war. At least 9 served as Minutemen at Lexington and Concord. Peter Salem fought at Bunker Hill in Saratoga. Enslaved people served as well. After fleeing his master in Rhode Island, Hugh Grant served in the American Army for 9 months. He later recalled, "When I saw liberty poles and the people all engaged for the support of freedom, I could not but like and be pleased with such thing. The songs of liberty thrilled through my heart." And that was from December 1st, 1836. The British offered, note, this would have been after that. This is him thinking back on his time. The British offered freedom to enslaved people who deserted and joined the British. Many thousand did so. They served mainly in support roles as cooks, blacksmiths, and teamsters. However, some people who had formerly been enslaved fought for the British. Also, that teamsters, that's like people who are helping bring the supplies to and from each location. Basically kind of a support role where they're helping get things where they need to go. On the American side, Washington at first refused to accept African American soldiers, but the British offer of freedom to enslaved people made Washington change his policy. By the end of the war, some 7,000 African Americans had served on the American side, including 2,000 in the Navy. African Americans also served in northern militias and state armies. Most southern states, however, refused to accept African American soldiers. Slave owners feared armed slave revolts. Freedom beckons. During the Revolution, a number of northern states took steps to end slavery. For example, a Pennsylvania law of 1780 provided for a gradual end to slavery. It allowed slaveholders to keep their existing slaves, but barred them from getting any more. Checkpoint question. Why did some enslaved Africans choose to fight for the British? The war at home. Many men enlisted or signed up for duty in the military. After a set term, usually 1 year, they were free to leave. Thus, Washington had to struggle constantly to keep the ranks of his army filled. Civilians, or people not in the military, also faced hardships. They were often subject to food shortages and military attack. Women. As men went to war, women took over many of their duties. On farms, women planted crops and cared for livestock. In towns, women often ran their husbands' businesses. Some women accompanied their husbands into military camps. In battles, they cared for the wounded. One woman, Deborah Sampson, joined the army disguised as a man. Wounded in battle, Sampson tended her own wounds in order to keep her secret. The added responsibility of wartime gave many women a new confidence. At a time when women's roles were largely confined, the war opened up new opportunities for many women. There's also one up here. Women in battle. When her husband was wounded at the Battle of Monmouth, Mary Ludwig Higgs dropped her water bucket and took up his cannon. Her heroic actions made her a legendary American hero, known as Molly Pitcher. Financial burdens. Paying for the war was a difficult task. Congress had limited resources with no power to tax. Congress had to plead with the states for money. However, the states had little money themselves. To pay and supply troops, Congress printed continentals, or paper money. But the more money Congress printed, the less the money was worth. By the end of the war, paper money had lost almost all its value. Checkpoint. What role did women play in the Revolution? Fighting in the West. Throughout most of the American Revolution, attention was mainly focused on the 13 states along the Atlantic coast. However, skirmishes and battles occurred on the western frontier as well. Native Americans take sides. Americans tried to keep Native Americans neutral. They offered payments to groups willing to remain at peace. Still, most Native American groups sided with Britain. They feared an American victory would mean more settlers moving west or south onto Native American lands. The turmoil of war hurt many Indian groups. Some tribes split into warring factions when they could not agree which side to join. Thousands of Indians were driven west by raids. Sometimes whole villages picked up and moved to avoid the fighting. Other Native Americans responded by attacking white settlements. A smallpox epidemic made matters even worse. The disease first spread among American soldiers in Quebec in 1775 and then along the east coast of the colonies. By 1779, it had reached New Orleans. Soon after, it spread to Native American groups all across North America. Smallpox deaths far outnumbered casualties during the American Revolution. By 1782, more than 130,000 whites and Indians had died from smallpox. In contrast, about 8,000 soldiers had died in battle during the same period. Defending the frontier. Seeking to defend against attacks on the frontier, Virginia sent George Rogers Clark and a militia force to strike British forts beyond the Appalachian Mountains in 1778. Clark's forces easily captured two Mississippi River outposts, Pulaski and Chocoya. Early in 1779, Clark and his men trudged across 200 miles, at times splashing through icy floodwaters up to their chests. Their midwinter attack on the fort at Vincennes caught the British by surprise. The British and their Native American allies surrendered. Clark's victories allowed settlers to remain on the frontier. This strengthened the American claim on the Ohio Valley area. Help from the Spanish. The Americans got unofficial help from Spain. At the time, Spain governed Louisiana, the land west of the Mississippi stretching as far north as Canada. The Spanish were eager to get back Florida, which they had lost to Britain at the end of the French and Indian War. Even before Spain declared war against Britain in 1779, Louisiana Governor Bernardo de Galvez began helping the Americans. He secretly provided money and munitions to George Rogers Clark's and other Americans. He also gave American ships safe refuge in New Orleans Harbor. And what that's talking about, money and munitions are like supplies. From 1779 to 1781, Galvez played a key role in Spanish attacks that captured British forts on the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. Financial help also came from the Spanish colony of Cuba. Checkpoint. What was the result of fighting in the West? The War at Sea. Congress had voted to create a continental navy as early as 1775, but American shipyards were able to build only a few warships. With only a small navy to go against the powerful British fleet, the Americans became skilled at making hit-and-run attacks on British shipping. Still, Britain dominated the seas. The British fleet blocked most ships from entering or leaving American ports. The most famous naval battle took place off the coast of England in 1779. The American ship Bohème Richard, under the command of John Paul Jones, fought side by side with the larger British warship Serapis. Cannon and musket fire ripped the sails of both ships to shreds and blasted holes in their wooden sides. Though his ship was in tatters, Jones refused to give up. "I have not yet begun to fight," he vowed. Finally, with dozens of sailors dead on each side, the captain of the Serapis surrendered. The Navy had help from some 800 privateers that harassed British shipping. Privateers are armed civilian ships that had their government's permission to attack enemy ships and keep their goods. Operating like pirate ships, privateers seized cargoes of rum from the West Indies, wool from England, and furs from Canada. Such attacks forced Britain to spend valuable resources protecting merchant ships. Checkpoint question. How did privateers help the American war effort? Looking back and ahead. Despite important battles at sea and in the West, the main war effort was concentrated in the colonies. In the next section, you'll read about the final phase of the war.